The next set of questions are all about learning Asian languages, specifically Chinese and Japanese. For instance, Gustav asked, when you're learning Japanese and Chinese, there is a lot of ground to cover. You have to learn characters, you have to learn vocab, the sounds, the grammar. What progression would you suggest when learning an Asian language?
Well, that's interesting because I always consider language learning as a holistic process, meaning you learn it as a whole. I don't focus too much on, I'm learning vocab, now I'm learning pronunciation. I learn everything at the same time. That said, I would say that in the case of Chinese, every language is different, obviously. So, for example, if you have a method, a way to approach languages, it's a good way to to change it a little bit according to the language you're learning. Now, in the case of Chinese and Japanese, they're special languages, obviously, because they're completely different. First, they're completely different from a phonetic point of view. Secondly, you have the problem of characters. Now, I would say that in the case of Chinese, the most difficult and challenging aspect of learning Chinese in general is pronunciation. People have a lot of problems with tones because they're not used to tonal languages. Now, for those who don't know what tonal languages are, basically in every language there are tones. We change our pitch, so syllables are at different heights depending on what kind of language, etc., etc. But in Chinese, tones actually define meaning. So if you pronounce a word like ma and you pronounce it like ma, there are two different words and they have two different meanings. Now, that is difficult because it's completely different, but I think that people make it more difficult than it actually is. If you think about it, Chinese themselves, they don't know these things about tones. If you ask them what kind of tone is that, oh, the third, the fourth, but I don't think about it because they learn it by chunks, for example. They didn't learn the single tone. So knowing how to pronounce to learn tones is quite important. And having said that, in Chinese, I would say that one of the most important things to do at the very beginning, is to focus on pronunciation. Not only how words and vowels are produced, so tones, and as well as consonants, because there are retroflex, they're called retroflex consonants, they're a little bit difficult, and then you can move on to other aspects of the language. Well, I would say, first of all, learning as a whole. Try to learn it as a whole, but focusing on pronunciation is not a bad idea, because once you get the pronunciation right, everything is easier, because grammar is I wouldn't make the mistake of saying that Chinese grammar is pretty straightforward. At a basic level, it's pretty straightforward. When you move on to intermediate and advanced, it's much more difficult because Chinese has a different way of conveying ideas, so you have to completely change the way you express yourself, even if the grammatical structure is apparently simple. But in general, I would say pronunciation first. Obviously, you still learn the language, and then you move on, for example, to you create a bond between the sound and the written language, pinyin. The other step is try to stick to pinyin at first, the transliteration, in Latin alphabet, because it's going to be much easier. And then after 2 or 3 months, you can start learning characters. One more thing, and this goes for both Chinese and Japanese, is that the amount of characters that you can actually handwrite has nothing to do with your fluency. You can be fluent in Chinese without even being able to read characters if you wanted that to happen. But I suggest that recognizing characters and being able to read is an important part. If you want to understand the culture, you want to understand, it's part of the culture. So recognizing and being able to read characters is one thing, but to handwrite them is another ability. Language learning, when we talk about learning, reading, listening, speaking, we take for granted that they're all ingrained in our brains. And as native English speakers, as native speakers, we develop all these abilities at the same time. That's why we can do all of them. But if we try to learn another language, you will see that you can learn to read, but not to understand. Connected speech, oral speech. Or maybe you can understand, but you're not able to talk. Or you can write something, but you're not able to speak. So they're separate things. And as I said, Chinese characters, reading, being able to recognize a Chinese character, and being able to write it are two different abilities that can be developed at the same time, or one can be developed a little bit later. And in the case of Chinese, I suggest you develop it later because it's very time consuming. If what you want is to be able to write Chinese characters because of the beauty of it, because you love calligraphy, etc., then by all means go for it. But remember that at the beginning, it's not a strictly necessary condition to speak Chinese fluently. And if your goal is to speak Chinese fluently, first focus on the bond between sound and written word, focus on pronunciation, focus on words and grammar, and then go for the characters. The same thing is for Japanese. It's slightly different. In the case of Japanese pronunciation is much easier because the phonetical inventory of sounds, the number of sounds, different sounds, is not that complicated, especially for Italians, but in general. So on the one hand, pronunciation is not a problem. Maybe the pitch in Japanese, the pitch is a little bit different. It's a different problem, but that has to do with intonation. But I would say with Japanese, focus more on the language itself, on the syntax. The main challenge for us Europeans, speakers of Indo-European languages, is the fact that in Chinese, in Japanese, as much as in Korean, the syntax is actually the opposite. You know, you don't say I want to go to China because I like it. They say China, I like it because, or since China want. You know, it's completely different. So you have to focus on expressing yourself in a very different way, and then you can focus on you can refine pronunciation. So you have to, so all in all, you have to consider the language as a holistic process. You have to try to tackle all these aspects at the same time. But in the special case of Japanese and Chinese, you have characters. If you want to learn characters, if that is your main goal, by all means, start doing that immediately. But this is one activity on its own. And then, obviously, you can focus also on the other aspects of the language. But this is pretty important. This is something very important to say, because I heard so many times, I got asked so many times, how many characters do you know? And this is like, hey, are you fluent? So that was like kind of, if you know 4,000 characters, then you're fluent. And it's absolutely not true.